did before, and come and do once more. We want to be a part of your story. God of our mothers and fathers, show your glory to your sons and daughters. What you were back then, come and be again. We want to see your power in our presence, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place. Come and move, God. Move, God. Move, God, in this place. God of our mothers and fathers, send your spirit just like you promised. You can have your way, visit us today. We want to see your power in our presence, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place, in our time and in our day. Come and move in this place. Come and move, God. Move, God. Move, God, in this place. God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. God of our mothers and fathers, come be our God. Come take the vineyard you planted and make us new wine.
Can someone grab my Bible in my bag? Welcome, everybody. I'm on, right? I am. Okay, good. Okay, welcome. And to those of you that are online with us, thank you so much. To those of you that are online, welcome to you as well. We're glad that you're here. And everyone here, we're so glad you're coming out and joining us tonight. It's so nice to have all of you. Sorry. So, give you a couple things as we get started. Always when you come in, there's a mercy box under the cross, and there we put in things like just spare change for things like life relief and stuff to help other people and help each other out. When on the information table, there's the offering basket, and that's always a place you can put physical offering if you have it from week to week. And just a reminder that tonight we're going to be planning to go out to House of Pizza together afterward and after our gathering. So anyone here, you're welcome to join us. Just let me know, and we'll make sure to have you join us and participate with us. So that is it. Are we good? Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. You can open your Bibles to Genesis 4. We're going to start in Genesis 4. So, we've been in a long discussion on the idea of exile and just trying to understand these themes throughout the Bible in how do they inform us as to what is God doing on the earth. And so last week when we started to talk about exile, we talked about what it is, we talked about why does it happen, and what has God done to make the way back. And so last week when we were looking at it, exile is the idea of being cast out of or removed from God's presence. And today that's known as sacred space. Another word for it is sacred space. It's sacred because God is holy, sacred because God is there. And that space, we are to be exiled is to be removed from God's presence, from his sacred space. So why do people we talked to last week, why are people removed from God's presence? They're removed because, number one, God has made some rules, like every tree in the garden you can eat from, but of this one tree, don't eat from this tree. And then if you break God's rules, you end up being removed from God's presence. So we see that in the creation account and so forth, and through to chapter 3 with the fall. So that's kind of how the idea of exile works. And then we see this theme come through that it happens over and over and over again throughout Scripture. So God, in his kindness, though, he didn't just kick us out and kick us to the curb. In his kindness, he's made the way back. He's made the way for us to come back to him. And if you've grown up in the church, if you've been around for quite a while in Christianity, you may have heard the word reconciled to God. You may have heard the word redeemed and redemption and all those things. Those are simply words that communicate the idea of we are being restored relationally to God. Now, on this side of the cross, we know that was done by the work of Jesus on the cross, and we're glad for it. But that's the idea of just a kind of quick recap of exile. Now, we're going to continue this idea in this way. Tonight, we're going to keep looking through the Old Testament, but I want to set this up with just this little question and example. So, have you ever lived in a place that is say different than where you were born and where you grew up? Have you ever traveled to a place or lived there for an extended period of time? Anywhere that has been like, this is not where I was born and raised. We have a few in here with us tonight about that. Anne-Marie, when she was 21, she moved over to Germany for a year, and she lived and worked there as a nanny. The technical term is au pair, and she was there with a German family, and the experience for her, she would probably tell you, was both wonderful and hard at the same time. It was great because she got to experience the culture, she got to experience a new language, new culture, a new setting, new food, new people. All that newness was exciting. And the experience was challenging because it was new people, new food, new setting, new culture, new way of doing things, new language that she didn't understand and had to work really hard to learn. All these things, it was wonderful and hard at the same time. And the question is, like, why? Because it's not home. It's like culture sets us up to just be familiar with how we do things. And in one sense, she would kind of say, or someone else that might move away and live somewhere, they're like, this is nice, but it's not home. It's not where I was meant to be. It's not what I'm familiar with, because we grow up in a culture, and the culture gets kind of really ingrained in us by feel, not just by expression. And in that, you can have that sense of either longing for the place that you're not. And I want to make the connection in this way, that how does this illustration compare and fit with the idea of exile? Because we were created to be in the presence of God, to live in community, in harmony with Him in His presence. But as we know and as we've seen, sin separates us from that. And so the Bible talks about that separation as being exile. Exile being separated from God. And so tonight, as we look through this, I want us to kind of be able to have some illustrations and examples that will connect us to the idea, because I'm talking, understandably, not about just some nice little neat package that we can look at, but I'm talking about something that we see that's an arcing narrative through all of Scripture. And it's very hard to hold those things in our mind together without, hopefully, some imagery. So, what we're going to look at tonight is that we're not living where we were meant to be. We were meant to be living in the presence of God. We're going to look at this repeating idea of exile throughout the New Testament or the Old Testament. And what I hope is that it will help us to see the idea as a biblical theme and relate to it, but that as we see how this theme repeats itself over and over through the Old Testament, even just the Old Testament, is that humans continually fall short of God's standard. We'll see this in them, and as we see it in them, I hope we'll see ourselves. But what the Bible wants to communicate to us, that it's not about seeing, well, we fall short while we do. And that's still called sin too. But the Bible wants us to learn from this stuff. The Bible wants us to learn how to learn. Just catch that a second. The Bible actually, in telling us this story over and over, through different people's experience and their different stories, the Bible wants us to learn how to learn from our own mistakes so we don't keep making them. That's one of the big takeaways from exile, and that instead we learn how to live by God's standard so that we can live in the blessing of the commands He's given us. Does that make sense? And so the Bible wants us to see that repetition so that we can learn from the mistakes. We're going to begin tonight with the story of Cain. If you remember Cain in Genesis chapter 4. So let's start picking this up. We'll start reading. Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the fruit of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. we'll stop there for a minute and just pick the story up. But so in the story of Cain, we see that Cain's sacrifice was not pleasing to God, but Abel's was. And Cain recognizes this in his life, and he's recognizing something about what I'm doing is just not pleasing God. Now, let's just pause for a moment, and I'm going to kind of, with an assumption, say, those of us here recognize this story and have likely been taught that the reason that God didn't like Cain's sacrifice was because it was fruit and not animal. And maybe you've heard that, maybe you haven't, but if you have heard that, I think it's important to understand that's a very cautious thing to say from this passage because sacrificial system is nowhere in sight yet. That is taking something of the future of the Bible and still reading it back into the passage. So we need to think a little differently about the passage, not about sin, but about the passage, and ask the passage, what is it saying unto itself? And so God says to him, what are you upset about? If you're doing well, if you're doing right, are you not going to receive blessing? Are you not going to, is my favor not going to be on you? And God is telling him mostly this. And so what God says to Cain, though, is be careful. Sin is looming at the door of your life. And we can recognize sin and temptation sits crouching, waiting at the doorway of our life, waiting to take advantage of the things that the ways we can become susceptible to believe a lie and begin to internally or emotionally internalize lies for ourselves. And when we start doing that, that's going to set us up for the enemy to start to have a heyday and create a division in our life with God. Sin is crouching at the door, Cain, and if you're not careful, it will consume you, and you are supposed to, here's the word, rule over it. So I want to just, even right here, I've told you before that there are places where these themes, we've talked about the theme of kingdom, we've talked about kingdom, we've talked about the theme of marriage, we've talked about, oh man, it's just skipping my brain, and exile now, sorry. And I've told you that at times these themes overlap in passages. It doesn't say the word rule arbitrarily. That's intentional. That goes right back to temple, where we were supposed to have dominion over the earth and rule over it. It's kingdom language. Language of we are meant to be something higher with God, more noble and ruling with him, but when we sin, we're going to lose that. What is he saying here? The indication that I've said before is actually in this passage that what they did to sin was not eat an apple. What they did was they gave in to the sensual, emotional lusts of their life and decided to make decisions from that wisdom. Not God's wisdom, not God's way of wisdom. And Jesus shows us, among other things, Jesus shows us what God's wisdom is oftentimes to practice delayed gratification, denial of self, take up your cross. It's the long-term decisions at the expense of short-term ones. And often when we're making short-term decisions, they are sensual, they're emotional, they're driven by something that is going to set us up for long-term hardship while it may satisfy the immediate. I believe that this is what they did in sin. It's not telling us an exact, it's telling us a concept. And so he says, be careful. You're supposed to get hold of your emotions and rule over them. And if you don't, sin is waiting to destroy you. we're told after that Cain, here's the reason it's emotions, because Cain, it says Cain was jealous of his brother Abel and killed him in the field. So Cain wanted to appease his own jealousy of his brother's acceptance, and this is what he did to fix that problem. And that we would begin to realize as people ourselves just how we do the same thing in life, or just how often we do the same thing in life. Because if we can, we have the ability in Jesus to hopefully be able to make that transformation. We can contribute to that effort. And Jesus himself says that part of the work is always on our side. And so God banishes Cain for his sin. He banishes him from the ground, and Cain says, "You're driving me from the ground," he calls it. "You're driving me from the ground." And he gets all concerned. If people are going to attack me, they'll kill me, and so on. And so it says Cain was driven from the area into the land of, I don't have it here, but the word is wandering, into the land of wandering. So that's the first place we see this. But then you come a couple chapters later into the Genesis flood. And we've often heard of this as a story about Noah and an ark and the animals that go in it, and how God preserved Noah and the ark, or in the ark with all the animals. And that's how, after this flood that filled, we think scientifically, the entire globe. But for them, it's likely that it was some major thing. If you want to think science for a minute, it's actually quite as possible that it was, let's call it localized, regionalized, massive destruction in one area. It could be global, but it doesn't necessarily say that, because there are possibilities that the word can mean their world, not the world. So anyway, that though, be aware that thinking is all about science, and the Bible is a revelation of God. So we're not going to read the passage. We're going to allude to the flood story in this case. And keep in mind, this is the flood story of Noah in Genesis 6-9. So in Genesis 6:4-5, God sees in Genesis 6:5-6, it says how God sees the wickedness of all of humanity, that it is continual on the earth. The sin of each human being is so widespread that it grieves God's heart. And he says, I'm not going to abide with this. I regret that I created humans in this case. So he decides, I'm going to start over. But remember, with exile, he starts over, he always makes the way through. He makes the way back in the midst of sin. And so he starts with a righteous remnant. He finds Noah, and he sees righteousness in Noah, and he says, I'm going to wipe the whole thing out and start over with you. So in this case, the sin of the humans became so great that God does this. In the end of the flood story, what we see is new creation. You see the waters come back into the earth. That's chaos coming back. And think chaos of the initial creation story. The waters covered the whole face of the earth. This is the waters. When the land divided the waters and gave boundaries to the waters, eventually the waters came back in on them. Chaos came back in. And then after a time, the waters recede. You see the land eventually dividing the waters again, and Noah sends out the dove, and at one point, finally, it comes back with a twig. And what you see is the story of new creation, the pinnacle of this, where God says to Noah the same words he said to Adam and Eve: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So they're given the Adamic instruction. They're given the same instruction a couple chapters later. But what this is the result of is it's the result of the repetitive failure of human beings. The sin that became so rampant and widespread is that repetitive failure. And so then again, now, let's fast forward through the Old Testament and we come to the story of the Promised Land. The children of Israel, we're skipping over other exile things such as Isaac and Jacob and then Joseph going into Egypt already from outside the land. But we're skipping over some of those just for the sake of time. And what we see here is when the children of Israel were in their Exodus time, they were then given 40 years as punishment for disobedience as well, and they were withheld from going into God's promised land. The promised land is the picture of new Eden. And in Leviticus 18, we see this idea that 18:24 to 30. Let's actually read it. Sorry, I'm not there, but Leviticus 18. I'll get there quick. Leviticus 18. We'll read 24 to 30. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inheritance. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge, never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Do you hear the repetitiveness of the nations that were there before you? Don't make the land unclean with these actions and so forth. The actions were this whole set of describing sexual deviation in every single angle from every perspective, so that it was left to understand the only acceptable sexual relation is one man and one woman in the bond of marriage. And everything else God set outside of that standard. That was one of the things getting ready to go into the land. And then he says, don't make idols, don't make images either, and don't because that's going to lead you to worship the other gods, not me. God says these things, he told the children of Israel, these are the things that led the other people in this land before you to get vomited out. Now, clearly we don't use that language. We don't even think that way. But this is image culture, not written culture. And in image culture back then, that's how they thought. They saw what happened, and the picture for them was, oh, see? The land spit them out. That's how they thought. It's fascinating to me to see the difference in the thinking. So God once again has a standard, and he says this is what we're going to do in order for us to have a relationship, because I'm bringing you into this land again so that you and I can live together like I wanted it to in the first place. And I'm doing this so that the way that we do life together can be a light to all the other nations around you. Sound familiar? And so God gives them these things, and he says, if you do this, then it'll be great. If you don't, be careful. He's basically warning them. And when we think of the wrath of God, well, why would God just kick them out? That's not loving. Well, but isn't warning someone an act of love? God warned them ahead of time and said, please don't do this, because if you do, the land is going to kick you out, just like it did the other inhabitants. And then, from here, when you read the rest of the Old Testament, from here you see the story. It's kind of like you get this, the story of humanity moves along at a pretty good clip. And then all of a sudden, when you can understand the whole narrative, then you've got the whole rest of the Old Testament. And what it does is it's like it opens up and gives us all kinds of detail everywhere. It tells us much more in depth about the life of the nation of Israel as the people of God in the promised land. It goes on this whole narrative of their history where they were pre-kings with the judges and how they screwed that one up. And then how they chose a king instead of God as their king, and how that eventually led them also into idolatry. Then how because of the kings, and eventually they split because one king didn't want his people to go down after Solomon. He didn't want the people to go into the southern part of the kingdom and worship God in Jerusalem, so he made a different place. This different place, that one compromise, led to another compromise, which led to the willingness to make more compromise, and more compromise, and more compromise. And before you know it, they're not worshiping Yahweh, they're worshiping this God called Baal. And there's a competition for this going on among the gods. And in that, they eventually are led astray. And what happened is there was two kingdoms, and the northern kingdom was called Israel, if you remember, and the southern kingdom was referred to as Judah. The northern kingdom became so decrepit and depraved that it was taken over long before the southern kingdom of Judah, and those 10 tribes were scattered into the world, into the other peoples around them. And you read in the Bible, it says they were lost to this day. Really what that means is the time of the writing, not to 2021. They were lost from that time till the time that it was written. And so then the southern kingdom comes in. And the southern kingdom only follows, they were a little more faithful to God, but only for a couple more 100 years. And God sent them. Have you ever read the prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Hosea, or the minor prophets, Amos, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Malachi? These prophets were men that God sent at various times to warn them and say, please turn back to me. Because if you don't, it's going to get really bad for you. Please turn back to me. And this is the story of God taking place over hundreds of years, where God bears with them, and what he sees of them is not just that they worshiped in idolatrous ways, but he sees it like adultery. We see in other passages we won't take the time to look at right now, but God saw it that way. And God, in one sense, divorced himself from them, and he sent prophet after prophet after prophet saying, please stop doing this. And then, finally, okay, that's it. Now, even if you repent, I will not change my mind. And what is coming is going to happen. And do I have it here, or is it the next? in 597, between 597 and 587 BC, the nation of Judah was taken over by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And so then we see that 1 Chronicles 9:1 says this, the people of Judah were exiled to Babylon, here it is, because they were unfaithful to the Lord. Over a long period of time, they were unfaithful to the Lord, and they continually rejected the pleadings of God through the prophets. They rejected it over and over and over again. And in 1 Chronicles 9:1, they believe that Chronicles was actually written, one of the last books of the Old Testament to be written, in fact, after the exile. Wouldn't it make sense that it was written after this exile? Because it's telling you a historical idea right here. The people of Judah were exiled to Babylon because they were unfaithful to the Lord. So once again, this passage tells us why. And you have that northern kingdom already, and the southern kingdom then fell at this time. But then Daniel, the book of Daniel, picks up not the why, but it picks up the when. And the Bible is not meant it's not meant actually to be a history book, but there are places that it connects to human history. And this is one of them. You can see this idea and the Israelite exile all over other Babylonian and Assyrian and Persian historical accounts. But Daniel 1:1 says, when it took place, the exile, when did it start? It started in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And so what you have is, Daniel was written through the lens of the Jewish people. And so if you pick this up elsewhere, here it's going to say in the 3rd year of this king. But elsewhere it's going to say where this takes place in human history is 597 to 587 BC. So for our purposes, though, the why is the most important. The when is an interesting point, but why is most important. Why were they exiled? Once again, supporting this idea. Because you come back to God and then we fail. And when we fail, bad things happen. What kind of bad things happen? We get removed from God's space. When we harm each other's relationships, what happens there? There's distance. There's emotional distance. There's like intimate distance between us, isn't there? That's just human relationship. But the point is, this is what it's like for God as well. Now, while the people were unfaithful, and this is something that is incredibly important, that the issue is not on God's side. The matter of faithfulness is clear in the biblical record. The issue is on our side. God is continually faithful. He's perfectly faithful. He's eternally faithful. Even in the places where God has warned them and told them this is what's going to happen to you through the prophets, even when he was warning them. And in Ezekiel, Ezekiel is one of the books of prophetic books where God is saying, okay, it's done. No matter what you do, I've given you all the chances I can give you. If I keep giving you chances, I'll no longer be God because I'm too liberal with this. It'll be unjust in the other way. And so he says, what's done is done. Now you're going to go into exile. In Ezekiel 11, we start to see the let's say the condemnation of God come. And in it, Ezekiel 11, though, on the second half of the chapter, starting in verse 14 to 21, God says, but you know what? Here, let's read verse 17. It says, I will gather you from the peoples and the assembly, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. So even in the midst of God saying, I'm going to scatter you, in the same prophetic word, he says, but eventually I will make the way back. I will bring you back. And what I'm hoping we see is not just the consistency of human failure, that we would be able to learn from it, but I hope that we would see the consistency of God's faithfulness, that really what God has done is he's the one that has always and continually provided the way of return. Jeremiah 33:7-8 says this, I will restore the fortunes of Judah and the fortunes of Israel. That's very end times prophetic. I'll use that word, end times prophetic. There's a big deal in that one into the New Testament with regard to exile. I will restore the fortunes of Judah and the fortunes of Israel and rebuild them as they were at first. I will cleanse them from all of the guilt of their sin against me. And I will forgive all of the guilt of their sin and rebellion against me. So while the people were unfaithful to God, God still plans to be faithful to them. Because while he loves Israel as people, his plan is also so much bigger than just Israel. His plan was for all of humanity, not just Israel. But without restoring Israel at that point, God cannot redeem all of humanity. And it's actually his desire to do both. So, conclusion. In conclusions, I want to begin to really focus in on what does this teach us about God? What does it show us about God first? So, conclusion. Yes, exile shows us that God has standards. God commanded obedience to those standards because those standards are what enabled relationship with him in the midst of an imperfect and fallen world. God commands a certain standard. The next thing is that God is the one who is faithful and unfailing. My question with that is, do we believe this emotionally? Because the chances are all of us in our Christianity and our religiosity are willing to say, oh, I know God's faithful. But it's really at the heart of the emotion that if it's not here, if that truth is not anchored here in our emotion, then really what we have is we have a false relationship with God and one that's at strife with God. God wants our relationship with him to be free of that anxiety. And so it takes us being willing to be emotionally real and emotionally vulnerable about how do we feel about God often. God is the one who is faithful. Where the problems in our life lie, we need to be able to accept the fact that it's not God's fault. There's something that we've got going on. Any separation is because of that human disobedience. We talked about this last week. These emotional responses are what end up creating the distance between us and God. Now, God, out of his love, has provided the way back. It's called redemption and redeeming. It's his love that compelled him to create this way back. While God removes humanity from sacred space, from his presence, he's the one that makes the way back. We know this is provided through Jesus. There are Old Testament passages that tell us this. We've come right up against them, but for the sake of time, we can't do anything exhaustive to see it. But what this also shows us that if God is the one who made the way back, what it seems to me that it indicates about God is that God is a good God. God is kind. God is long suffering with our misunderstandings of him. God is long suffering even in the face of our accusations of him. How amazing is God when we can step back and first say, what does this passage show us? We often ask the phrase, what does this mean? But when we can step back and say, what does this show us about God? I think it opens up a lot more depth and orients our walk with God more properly. It also shows us that God is a God of compassion, because in his compassion, he heals us, he redeems us, he delivers us from the oppression, and he sets us free, and he makes the way for us back. God is a compassionate God. Do we trust that? Now, in application, finally, to finish up, in application, this is where we can begin to ask questions of ourselves. How does my life line up with this understanding of God? Or doesn't it? And this is where rubber begins to meet the road. And so what I would say is that we would recognize the places that we continually fail. What we need to see from Scripture is that we need to see our own cycle. Not so that we can beat ourselves up with the failure, but so that we can recognize it and ideally we bring this to God. As if to say, I don't have much to offer you. It probably feels to you and me like all I've done is fail you. But this is what I have. Can I come to you? Can I come back to you? Even if this is all I've got to bring. My failures, my feelings of failure, and so forth. Because what we see in God is his answer would be unequivocally yes. But we need to be able to recognize this cycle in our life, because it's this cycle that keeps us from fulfilling the very purposes in our life, both in the idea of a human being. We were meant to rule the world with God, not rule over it in dictatorial fashion. We were meant to have a higher place than we have. It's not God's fault, it's us that gets in the way of fulfilling that potential. And it's that same thing that gets in the way of us fulfilling our own individual, very personal giftings and potentials. The things we believe about God or not. Things that I've believed about God was that he was not going to provide for me. Things that I've believed about God in my past is he likes you more than he likes me. I've believed those things for years. I believe that God gave other people gifts that he didn't give me because he didn't want to. It sounds ridiculous even to my ear at the moment to say it, but these are truths that I've lived with for many years about God. What else do we learn? We learn to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them over and over and over. If we don't learn from our mistakes, we will repeat them over and over and over. But if we can see this idea about exile, that one of the lessons exile hopes to teach us is that we would learn to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them so we can move on into more of the good things of God. But we need to be able to ask God for help to do this. This is not an on our own effort thing. This is, God, I invite you into this part of my life because I need help. Please help me learn this. And finally, that it requires humility on our part to surrender to this is God's standard. Pride is willing to break the standard and not care. Humility is what's necessary to acknowledge that this is a standard I'm not allowed to break. I can, but I get all the consequence. But humility is what's birthed in us and honed in us over long periods of time that says, oh, I don't do this. And what this does with exile is it helps us learn and see more that when we're not thinking in terms of exile, we will end up thinking more in terms of moral behavior. Our faith will boil down to moral behavior. But if we can think in terms of exile of a concept, it will help us think more in terms of relationship with God and how I don't hurt that relationship. Because God is a relational God who wants that relationship with you and with me. So, I hope this little walk through a very small portion of this, but through segments of the Old Testament, does help us have a picture more broadly of the idea of exile, and that it can begin to be a seed that informs and enriches our faith and our walk with Him. So for those online, we just say bless you, and we hope you have a wonderful day tomorrow and the beginning of a wonderful week. For those of us here, we're going to move into a time of worship and